Alex, how's everything going?
Not bad, not bad. This is Alex Bell here. I'm speaking with Mark Stevens.
This is Marcus Stephens. Just a little bit at the beginning. We're gonna have a normal conversation. We don't know where this is gonna take us. We don't have any plans for the future, but we're just out here enjoying ourselves, and hopefully you guys enjoy what you're listening to.
I think the beauty of this is that it's like unscripted, unplanned. We're not really, we're putting thought into it, obviously, the day of and in the moment, and maybe the night before, but we're not going to have very explicit lists and restrictions for time and topics and stuff like that. We're going to let it branch naturally. And this isn't anything new. We've been having these conversations for a while, obviously.
And that's one of the things that led us to even start doing this, is we've had so many great conversations, and at least me personally, I always wished that I had a record of them. For future reference, for just all the great points that you've made in the conversations. So I figured, these are very enjoyable.
Agreed.
Why not?
Yeah, agreed. And if nobody else listens to this, I don't really care, as long as we can listen to it and we'll have a record.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it should be nice for us.
Yeah. So I guess at least for this first episode, we have a few talking points that we could just use as, boosters for the conversation.
Yeah.
So should we start with...
Your call.
Sure.
You lead the way.
So let's see. Of the four that we chose...
Oh, I'm trying to remember what I sent you.
Eastern versus Western medicine.
Yeah, so this was a conversation I had on the way to my medical school retreat. And we talked about it for a while. It's, I haven't really formulated the thoughts, but in general... It seems that in Western medicine, we place a higher value on patient autonomy, patient knowledge of their condition, over Eastern medicine. And in some East Asian countries, for instance, they might not tell the dying grandfather what illness he has or the status of his condition. They might just tell him the minimum he needs to know just to comfort him, and they might go to the child of the grandfather or to the surrogate caretaker of the grandfather and tell them the details of the care. Whereas in the U.S., we have a very strong emphasis on the patient makes the decision for themselves. Those differences between East and West, I hate to categorize as East and West, but this is just general trends, obviously. I'm stereotyping. But those differences kind of maybe are manifested in how we treat our family. I feel like there's I don't want to say a closer connection of family in the East, but there's a different kind of reverence or respect for elderly, for parents. There's like an unspoken connection with people of the same blood, and I kind of see that carrying down into how we treat our patients broadly.
I would say that there is much more of an emphasis on the importance of family in the East.
Yeah.
As you were saying, it goes back to the individual versus the collective.
Yeah.
And in the West, the individual supersedes everything. In the East, it's I guess in the West, the individual is the unit of society.
Right.
But in the East, it's the family that's the unit of society.
Yeah.
And that probably explains a lot of what we see in the field of medicine. Not telling a patient what he has. That's something that would be unthinkable in America or in Western countries.
Right. And it can actually cause you to get a strike on your medical license, right? It looks bad to withhold information from the patient. All of these board questions that we had on what do you do in this case? Do you tell the patient? Do you just tell the patient's mother? A lot of the things we emphasize in the U.S. are telling the patient. So it's interesting.
It's one of the first things we learn about in medical school, the four basic tenets of, I guess, Western ethics.
Do you remember them?
Let's see.
Altruism.
Autonomy.
Okay, altruism, autonomy.
Is altruism one of them?
Or benevolence or something like that?
Benevolence,
okay, that's it.
Benevolence, non-maleficence.
Okay.
Autonomy, and justice.
Okay, yeah. And those were kind of talked about when we talked about the Hippocratic Oath and all that, so...
Yeah, and they were presented to us as dogma, that there is absolutely no questioning them, that this is standard ethics that everyone agrees upon. But at least in my experience, other points of views weren't really discussed or emphasized.
Right. Not here, at least. Not in the U.S., at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very in line with like the American individualism, right? The libertarianism, which is a little ironic because for a libertarian society to exist, if you don't have the support of government or the support of social systems, you rely on the family unit, you rely on the community unit. So it's almost paradoxical how you can be a proponent of this individualism, but also not give the care surrounding a person in a tough situation and have them rely on family care. But maybe that's kind of a tangent. I guess what we were getting at is that they didn't teach us other points of view in the medical training we had here.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you had an ethics course?
Yeah, we had like a development course. It was like a social medicine branch of the curriculum, yeah.
Yeah. We had one also, and it went for, I think, 12 weeks.
Okay.
And 3 lectures per week. And out of all of these, we spent maybe 15 to 20 minutes discussing just one particular example of, and this was brought up in discussion, not even in the main lecture. And it was one example of one of our main lecturers was in Japan, and he worked at an ALS clinic there.
Uh-huh.
And he said that most of the patients that he saw there did not know that they had ALS.
Yeah, that's crazy.
All their family knew, their sons knew, they had no idea though.
Yeah, that would be a scandal in the US. That would be like the syphilis Tuskegee experiments. Right?
Yeah.
Like injecting people with the disease or treating people with the disease that they don't even know they have.
And it's I come from not a Western background, and so for me the Western view is very foreign. Like there are people who, one of the tenets that we learn is non-maleficence.
Right.
And this stems directly from non-maleficence, that if you tell the patient he has something that he can't handle, this will cause more harm than good.
All right, we're going to get spicy here. You just said the patient can't handle it. What gives you the authority to say whether or not the patient can handle it?
Yeah.
And I think that's like the Western view. Sorry, I broke this chair. I think that's the Western view that says, who are we to decide in the place of other people?
And that's the whole debate between paternalism versus I can't remember the other part of the spectrum.
What do you mean? Paternalism versus...
in medicine, paternalism versus...
It's like versus autonomy. It's like
versus autonomy. Yeah. Where in paternalism, it's the doctor develops a relationship with the patient over hopefully a long period of time, maybe even years, maybe even generations. If it's if the patient is in the same village and the doctor treated his grandfather, his father, and now the doctor is 80, 85 years old, and the patient is 15. And so in that kind of scenario, I think it is possible for the concept of paternalism to exist and to be hugely beneficial. That the doctor knows so much about the patient and has so much experience with other patients versus, the patient only has experience with himself, and at least as it comes to disease.
Right. I think in defense of the medical curriculum in the US, that is not the case at all. Like we have very few doctors that treat like that these days. And in addition, the U.S. has a very strong legal system against these doctors, right? Like so much of the doctor's salary goes to legal cases, and the U.S. is very strong on like suing other people. So in that context, in that framework, I think it makes more sense to be a proponent of autonomy and individualism. It's easier to blame other people when other people have made decisions for you, I guess is the point.
That is true, and a lot of Western medicine I've noticed is really trying to make sure that the blame does not fall on you.
Yeah.
So all these checklists that doctors have to go through, all these forms that the patients have to sign, it's really all just blame shifting.
Right, yeah. Like washing your hands of responsibility for this person.
Yeah.
The protocols we have, the algorithms we have. Yeah. That's almost like futuristic dystopian in a way. Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it, because ideally these algorithms that we have for patient care would be optimal, would be the best thing on average. So if the algorithm is perfect, then following the algorithm for patient care would be the best outcome, I think. You know what I'm trying to say? I don't know.
The problem is that I think the algorithm is designed specifically to, in light of the legal environment that the US is in. And so I don't think that the algorithm is necessarily perfect in terms of an outcomes perspective. I think sometimes the algorithm is just, you have to do so many extra tests that aren't necessarily beneficial to the patient, where you could
save money.
Save money, devote more of your attention to the actual problem versus going and trying to basically just make sure that your own self is covered because you did all these other tests.
Yeah. I think it comes down to like what you want to prioritize as a healthcare system. Do you want to prioritize efficiency and like choosing the right tests only in the right situation and be conservative about the testing you do to save money? Or do you want to cover your ass, be very comprehensive, test for everything, spend more money? There's kind of a trade-off there. It's like...
And that also goes back, to the individual versus the collective. Because in an efficient system, overall, I think society would benefit. Mm-hmm. But in the individual system, the individual benefits at the cost of society. Mm-hmm. Where you have all this red tape and extra things you need to make sure of. Because I would imagine that even in terms of making healthcare more accessible, probably the more efficient system would lead to less costs and cheaper healthcare.
Could be cheaper, yeah.
And it does probably go back to just the suing culture of
the U.S.
the United States.
Yeah.
There is I was reading the Apology by Plato.
Yeah.
It's when Socrates is defending himself against or defending himself to the Athenians who accuse him of impiety and corrupting the youth. And one very interesting thing that I read in it is that I think there were about 530 jurors.
Yeah.
And it mentioned in the text that if what's the name of the person who sues the other person? The claimant?
The plaintiff?
The plaintiff.
Yeah.
If the plaintiff doesn't get at least 1/5 of the jurors to side on his side, then he has to pay like 1,000 drachmas or something.
So it's like a penalty. It's like on the SAT, where if you get the answer right, you get 1 point. If you get the answer wrong, you get whatever.
Minus a quarter. Yeah.
So it's almost like you lose for false accusations.
Yeah. Yeah. And that would be provide some deterrence against people just going and suing whoever they want.
So is this for all charges and lawsuits, or is it just for, is it for everything? Because imagine what this would do to like rape culture if, in addition to all the legal mess that like a rape victim has to go through, if they additionally had to worry about paying out the ass if they can't convince 1/5 of the people that they got raped. So I think the legal system it's easy for some domains and it's harder for others. And when there's like all this social pressure against maybe rape lawsuits or like harassment lawsuits or misconduct lawsuits, it would make those even harder.
You know what? I will say that I would still go with the Greek system. And the reason is that once you raise a claim against someone else, then against their will, you're dragging them into it. And their reputation is at stake as well. At least from what I'm seeing these days, is you don't even need proof or anything. You could just put the claim out there, and someone's reputation will automatically go downhill because you said, oh, this guy did something
40 years ago, whatever.
40 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and then the avalanche of media, whatever criticism begins.
Exactly. So yes, it will, I guess, make it a little bit harder for victims to go and seek their justice. But at the same time, the flip side of that is that it will protect maybe innocent people from having claims raised against them.
I think,
and the cost, of course, is that some people won't have claims raised against them when it should have been raised.
Right. Yeah.
So a few will get away. I think more will be saved the terrible experience of being falsely accused.
I think if we were to draw a line that shows
the progress of social issues, whatever they may be. We can start with like black rights in the US and then women's rights in the US and now gay rights in the US. If we had this legal system, that would definitely slow that line of progress. Imagine if you have a lawsuit for any of those things, for any minority rights, discrimination or harassment or misconduct, any of those things, how much harder it would be to convince, or how much more hesitant you would be to make that case if you knew that you could be penalized if you don't convince 1/5 of the people. You know what I'm saying? Like, it essentially raises the threshold for what constitutes a good lawsuit. And the entire law industry, all these lawyers would say, no, that's not worth suing over. No, that's not worth taking to court. So it would slow social progress. Progressivism. It would slow progressivism.
That is true. Yeah, I can see that.
So if I guess it depends on what our main concern is. If our main concern is the false accusations, then that would be the direct solution.
Is progressivism always a good thing, though? That's another thing.
No, look at like Mao Zedong's reign of China, right?
Exactly.
Look at Stalin's reign of.
That's another thing actually that I don't want to go back to Plato all the time, but another one of his dialogues called the Crito is after Socrates is given the death penalty, he's in jail, and so one of his students, Crito, goes to him and tells him, "I have enough money to bribe the jailer to get you out.
Okay.
So just come along because tomorrow they're gonna kill you." And Socrates starts this beautiful dialogue between himself and the laws, with a capital L, the laws of the city of Athens.
Okay. Is that the lawyers? Is that like the Supreme Court equivalent? What is the laws?
No, the laws is this abstract notion of the laws that govern the society that you live in.
Okay.
And the main point of what he was trying to say in that dialogue is that he, as a citizen of Athens, voluntarily chose to live in Athens his entire life, and therefore he has made some sort of a social contract to abide by the laws.
Yeah.
And so Crito tells him, well, the laws are unjustly condemning you to death.
Right.
So it's really, unjust for you to go along with these laws.
Right.
And Socrates says the beautiful thing about these laws is that they allow themselves to be changed by you if you can convince everyone else in the society to change them. And I was given that opportunity my entire life, and apparently, I failed at making them better laws.
Right.
And based on my contract with them that I voluntarily chose to live in Athens instead of moving out to some other place, then I should follow through on my part of it. And I guess his final point is unrelated, but he says that the laws tell him that if you are suffering injustice right now, it is not because of us, but because of the men who are
before you, or who made the laws.
It's because of the men who are executing the law, and so that we as the law are perfect, but it is the men executing us, or I guess I shouldn't use the word execute in this context because he's going to get executed literally. Right. But it's the men who are enforcing us that are doing it unjustly. And so this goes back to the point that the laws are always changing.
Right.
And I think progressivism as a whole it has some great things and it could also have some terrible things. And so the thing that tethers society together is the laws. And with something like the penalty for not getting 1/5 of the jurors, that makes the laws more stable.
Yeah.
Whereas removing something like that would make the laws more dynamic and changing.
Yeah.
And I think the laws didn't come out of nowhere. They are the product of the collective unconscious of the past centuries of this society.
Adding up into this one moment, into this one situation, yeah.
Exactly. And so it all comes up, and it's the laws that brought us to where we are here today. And so it all ends up going back to the question of, do we think that we know so much more than the entire history of our nation?
Right.
That we are willing to abandon this particular set of laws and change it into this other thing, at the risk of I guess everything bad that could come out of it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so it is a risk. And I agree with the conservatism of having a stable law system. But looking through history, we do see some pretty egregious things that we've done in the past. Right? Like, okay, slavery was lawful at one point, but that was clearly a mistake. Right?
Yeah.
Suppressing women's suffrage was also clearly a mistake. How do we know what things we're doing now are mistakes to a similar degree? And I guess you could look back with the knowledge of today and say, oh, maybe the women were uneducated and they weren't ready to vote. But like that brings up a bunch of other social issues. Why weren't they ready? Why weren't they educated? Why weren't they, you know? Like, yeah, maybe slavery made more sense in the context of 1600, 1700 America, but it's still a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. It's hard to justify some of the things we've done in the past within the laws that we've created. So if the laws really are the like collective conscience of the people, I wouldn't say the collective conscience of the people is infallible.
I agree.
So I guess that's just an argument for the law system being dynamic.
Yeah, and I definitely don't think that the law should be something that is entirely unmovable. But you know, and I'm trying to think of some case in history where the laws changed too quickly.
The easiest for me is the Great Leap Forward in China. I think something like 1967-69, he decided to revise all of China's agriculture to make it socialized. And it wasn't done properly. It was done with a mindset of a small people in the capital, and it ended up affecting the entire country. There was the Great Famine of China. Tens of millions of people died. Huge disaster, largely attributed as a fault of, I guess, socialism, progressivism, things like that. Like, the country clearly wasn't ready for such an agricultural revolution, and mistakes were made and things were improper. You could look at, like, the Soviet Union's take on nuclear energy and how they rushed things and broke rules and told lies and ended up suppressing information that led to the Chernobyl accident.
That's true. That's another thing, yeah. I don't know if this would also fall into the same category, but you know, probably the rise of Hitler, early 1930s, and all the changes he made to German law, suppressing individuals' rights, and
That's interesting because the examples that I gave were like a very very left on the political spectrum movement. They were like for the collective people, whereas Hitler's rise was mostly nationalistic, fascist, for Germans, right? For this race, eliminate other races. So I guess
so I guess that makes these would be examples that show the argument not being necessarily favoring one belief over the other.
Agreed.
Or
yeah.
one direction over the other, but simply protecting us from radical change in any direction.
Agreed. Yeah, so being
first... It's like one of these calculus problems where you need to find the optimum solution.
Right. Derivative equals 0 and then find the equilibrium point. Yeah. No, so what are the downsides of us moving too slowly? Can we think of any examples of it? I mean, you could say, Saudi Arabia doesn't allow women to drive. That's pretty outdated. That should have ended 50 years ago. Well, I guess they do now, but...
Yeah, they do as if,
maybe
a year ago, 2
yeah.
years ago?
Yeah. But maybe that's a political stunt anyway. We don't even know.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe he's just doing that to gain to gain the West's favor.
But, Iran is clearly a pretty backwards country in terms of women's rights and education and stuff like that.
I think they're not allowed to walk outside without a hijab.
Or you get acid sprayed in your face or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So clearly that's the downside.
Well, see, that's another thing, is because the two examples you brought up were from the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And the Middle East is heavily influenced by Islam.
Oh, geez. Here we go.
Yep. You know where this is going. It definitely goes back to just looking good in the face of the West. Because we were talking about laws reflecting the history of its society, the values of its society. Mm-hmm. In the Middle East, the only value is Islam. As a whole, you know.
One of the top values, okay.
Maybe one of the top values, okay, but but societies in the Middle East are structured around Islam.
Yeah, there's no separation of church and state. Agreed.
No, and any separation between church and state is seen, between mosque and state is seen as like if a leader does that, they do it with extreme caution. They because the average man will be offended at even the notion of the state not being, because it would be seen as a state not being quote unquote holy.
Yeah.
And so going back to that, when we know that Islam is one of the main underlying factors in the laws of the country, in its ethics, in its worldview, it fully explains why women couldn't drive in Saudi Arabia until last year, why women are forced to wear the hijab, why men can have 4 wives and women can only have 1 husband. And so these changes, I think, are being brought upon by an external source, which is Western influence.
Okay.
And the desire to avoid Western condemnation for not allowing women to drive or something like that. Whereas I believe change in the Western world comes from a constant redefinition and improvement upon values.
Yeah.
That's the thing. That's one of the things that where at least the Middle East differs from the West, is that the West, I guess for most of its history, did look at its past with some reverence, but also with the idea that we're constantly moving forward.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, we always look at the past as something that is much greater than what we are now.
Yeah, that kind of explains Iran in the 60s. Women would, be more free than they were anywhere else.
Yeah.
And then they kind of regressed.
There are pictures I saw of women in the streets of Tehran wearing, skirts shorter than what American women were wearing at the time.
Happy, free, progressive. That's like the golden age of Islam was, 800 years ago. And they made all these, major achievements in math and science and astronomy and all these things. And now,
but that's another point, which I will. It is true that in what is called the Golden Age of Islam, all these Muslim scholars made all these achievements. But if you look at where these achievements were made, you will see that more than 95% of them were done either in the lands of Persia or Mesopotamia.
Okay, yeah.
Or Spain, in Andalusia. So the reason I have qualms about it being called the Golden Age of Islam is if it was Islam that was the cause of this, enlightenment,
right,
then you would expect that it would be the Arabian Peninsula that would have, the most flourishing technologies.
There no Islam in Persia at the time?
Where?
Was Islam restricted to the Arabian Peninsula?
No.
During the Golden Age?
It was not. But the thing is, Persia is the result of the Persian Empire. Darius the Great, Xerxes,
so you're saying
Cyrus.
it's other cultural efforts that led to these changes, that led to this enlightenment.
Yes.
And it didn't stem from
Mesopotamia
Mecca.
was, before it was captured by the Arabs, it was part of the Roman Empire, part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Same with North Africa, same especially with Spain.
Okay.
And so when you claim that, it's our religion that's inspiring all these people to great things, okay, well, why is it inspiring them only in places where they've had these great things going on for the past 500, 600, 700 years?
So what if the Golden Age of Islam is really just Islam being colonialist, going to these other places, spreading their religion, and then taking credit for the things they did?
Absolutely.
I've never heard this before. It's maybe a little Islamophobic, but it's an interesting take.
There was a Muslim scholar from the 14th century. He was born in I think in Tunisia. I can't remember his name, but one thing he said is that the Arabs never built a thing for themselves. They went and conquered the lands of the Romans and lived in their palaces and called their palaces their own. And this is something that
every society done this throughout history? The Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, the Jewish slaves did, right? Or the Americans just colonized, or Britain doesn't really do anything, they just colonize India and do everything there, even now people say, okay, the U.S. doesn't have any industry or manufacturing. We go to China and Vietnam, whatever. We go to these poor countries in the Philippines and like use their labor, use their factories. Isn't that characteristic of a lot of societies? What makes Islam intrinsically different in this regard? What's wrong with claiming the successes of people and places that you've taken over or had involvement with as your own if everybody does it? You know what I mean? I feel like, okay, the other criticism you made of Islam in the earlier, is that they don't have separation of church and state and that they kind of look to the past and are kind of regressive in their ruling of a place. That sounds very much like Christianity in the Crusades era or in the Middle Ages, where they had a stranglehold on science and prevented the progress of science and prevented women from doing things. They had all these like social impositions, and then they made people pay to go to heaven and increase the tits. It seems like okay, there's some toxic things about Islam, but I don't know if they're unique to Islam. I think other religions, other countries, other industries have the same toxic things about them.
I never said they were unique to Islam. I think they're very much amplified in Islam, but they definitely exist in other religions. And interestingly, all the examples you brought up were by the Catholic Church,
right? Okay,
which is something that I also reject. The Crusades were, maybe the Crusades is a bad example, because the Crusades ultimately is about taking back what was once Christian lands. It's the Muslims came in the 7th, 8th centuries.
Right.
They took over the Holy Land, Jerusalem, Israel, Palestine, and all that region. And the Crusades were just about taking back the lands from the Muslims.
Right.
So they were a retaliatory war. A lot of horrible things were done during these Crusades.
But still Catholic-led is what you're saying.
It's Catholic-led.
Yeah.
And you can that manifests itself most egregiously in the Fourth Crusade in the year 1204, where the Catholics wanted to get to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And the only thing that connects Europe to Asia, at least in that region, is Constantinople,
right.
Istanbul,
Turkey. Yeah.
And so they asked for the Roman Empire, which was based in Constantinople, to give them passage.
Yeah.
So they did, because they were also Christians. They were Orthodox Christians, which is different from Catholicism.
But they were complicit. Okay.
But they were both Christians. So they opened up their city gates to house the Crusaders until they could go and cross the next, whenever they were
until they could move forward. Yeah.
And the thing about the Western Europe at that time, compared to Constantinople and Eastern Europe, Constantinople was called, the jewel of the world. There was so much riches in this one city that Western people who lived in what we call now the Dark Ages couldn't even fathom. There was one Western traveler in the Crusades who said that 1/3 of all the gold of the world is in this city, in Constantinople. So when the Crusaders, who I guess in this context are like savages, saw this magnificence in this city, they raided it.
Yeah, and then they took it back.
They took it back. They went back to Venice mainly. And that was the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was against Constantinople. It wasn't against
the enemy
Muslims.
that they said, yeah.
And so, that's another thing about the Crusades being mainly
a war for riches and wealth.
Exactly, right? Rather than being driven by really Christian values.
Is that different than any other war? It's either for power or for wealth, and those are the same thing. Like, what is caliphate now? We could say caliphate is fundamentally different than the Crusades. The Crusades were reclaiming what you thought was yours, whereas caliphate is expanding Islam. But it's really just expanding your power and your wealth. What U.S. and Iraq, it's just expanding power, wealth, influence in the Middle East.
Yeah, which I think are all terrible.
Yeah, but
and that's the thing that
it just seems like that's a common thread in every war. That's not unique to Christians. That's not unique to. Sorry, that's not like.
Not unique to Muslims.
Right. I mean, it's not unique to the Crusades. It's not unique to anything. It seems like every war, every imposition against a different group, against a different society, is for power or wealth. But yeah, that's bad. And I also don't know any examples of Orthodox Christians having done anything similar.
I mean, for most of the, Orthodoxy didn't really have the separation of church and state. So the main, I guess, Orthodox entity politically in the past was what is called the Byzantine Empire, which is really
Right.
the Roman Empire. Um,
Became the Roman Empire. Yeah,
yeah, the what?
it became the Roman Empire, right? The Byzantine.
So what happened is the Roman Empire, it stretched from as far west as Spain to as
Yeah.
far east as parts of Persia at some point. And then in the 3rd century, it became too big that one emperor just couldn't handle all of it.
Okay.
And so I think Emperor Diocletian split the empire into Eastern and Western.
Okay.
The Western half fell in 476 with the fall of Rome, when I think Attila or the Huns maybe invaded Rome, and
Okay.
the Western Empire fell. The Eastern Empire, the eastern part of the empire, continued until 1453,
Oh wow. Okay.
when the Turks took over Constantinople.
Yeah.
In the 9th century, the Germans had Charlemagne,
Right.
who claimed to found the Holy Roman Empire. So he claimed to be the true successor of the Roman Empire. And so there was this thought in the Western, in Germany and France, that they are the true heirs to Rome and not the people in Constantinople, who by
Right.
that time were speaking Greek.
Huh.
So many German historians started referring to the Eastern Roman Empire just as the Byzantine Empire,
Just to make it sound different.
to make
Or
it sound like it's
foreign.
not really Roman.
Brilliant. Nice.
Yeah, so that's what.
That's some good propaganda from 1,000 years ago. Make them sound like they don't. But I guess it had fundamentally changed after all that time, too.
Oh, absolutely. Just like
And it wasn't
Just
even
like-
Catholic anymore, clearly.
in what
The
do you mean?
Byzantine Empire.
No, it's always been Orthodox.
Oh, even during the Roman Empire it was?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I guess.
Yeah. So that's the other thing about Orthodox and Catholicism is, we the Orthodox say that we're the original form of Christianity, and that the Pope broke off in the 11th century from
Right.
the other four. So he was a patriarch, and then there were four other patriarchs,
Yeah.
and that's what led to the division between Western and Eastern Christianity. So we say that the Roman Empire was always Orthodox, but then after the 11th century, the Western part of it became Catholic.
Right. Huh. So in a way, they're.
But yeah. I mean, going back to what we were saying about the wars, they did exist in the Roman Empire and in the Russian Empire as well, because that also kind of took over after 1453. It's
Mhm.
called Third Rome, Moscow,
Hmm.
because first there was Rome, then there was Constantinople, and then it's
They
Moscow.
actually call it that?
They called themselves Third Rome, and they said
Until when? Until socialism, maybe? Until World War II, probably. Like early World War One.
probably World War One.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's funny. So I don't know. Like we were kind of talking about progressivism and the social progress of time. Which things this is kind of another tangent, if we're ready for it. Which things are we doing now that you think we will look back at and realize is abhorrent? Like we can look back 200 years and say, oh yeah, slavery was definitely a mistake. In 200 years, what will we say, why did they do that in 2019? Or how could they possibly think that was okay? I have a couple ideas, but I want to hear what you think first. Things that we do now that are commonplace now that we don't even think of, that we're going to say, I can't believe they did that. That was so atrocious. And will become like a media buzzword like slavery or like as bad as Hitler or something like that. Like gay rights is almost over. I mean, not almost over, but it's made significant progress in the past 40 years, right? Gays are pretty well integrated into society, pretty well integrated into like power positions, right? CEO of the biggest companies like Apple, openly gay.
I mean, I would want to say abortion, maybe, but that would.
In which direction?
Yeah. See, well, that's the thing that, in my view, societies, it's not like a linear, a constantly upward linear trajectory of the morality of society.
Wait, for what though? For abortion or for
For
everything?
for everything in general.
But some things are.
Some things are, yeah.
Like human rights are. But then, okay, you could say abortion is
But
kind
then
of
I could
related
say,
to human
I
rights.
could say that 100 years ago it was unthinkable to legalize, the killing of what many would say are babies,
Right.
and that today we have no
Without
problem
thinking
with
about it, yeah. Okay, we'll get back to
what are your two?
My thought was eating animals. We would say, how could we put pigs in a cage like that, make them suffer for so many years, and then slaughter them and eat them without thinking about it? And everybody walks into cafeterias and eats pork chops or eats bacon or all these animal products that we have everywhere are actually coming from like a very sentient, a lot of times like as loving as a dog animal.
Which they eat in China.
Yeah, exactly. And we see that as terrible. I mean, we can't fathom eating our pets, right?
Mm.
I think in 200 years, we'll have lab-grown meat, maybe lab-grown organs, Honest Burger 3 or whatever they call it at the time.
Mm.
Is it Honest Burger? Yeah, that's the fake meat. Honest Whopper, whatever they have at Burger King now. And we'll look back and we'll say that was as bad as slavery.
Do you think that will be because it will be more economically feasible to develop it? Or
Yes,
is it
but you
gonna
could say
be
the
because-
exact same thing for slavery. It's more economic. In whatever, 1600, 1700 America, in order to survive in the South on a plantation, you needed slaves. So like, was Thomas Jefferson really a bad person because he had slaves? Or was he just doing what he had to do to get by? Am I really a bad person today for eating pork chops from the cafeteria? Or am I really just getting the protein source however I can? Or is the iron deficient woman really just getting the iron however she can by eating a burger? It's interesting how our perspective changes. And I think when we look back through history and judge like a past figure and say, oh, I can't believe this old president said the N-word or this old president had slaves or whatever, we need to like look at it through the lens of the time. Like it was impossible to survive in this era, in this location without slaves. But of course that doesn't make slavery okay.
I guess it goes back to the question of whether eating animals is itself immoral, which I think you seem to think it is immoral.
I think that question, you get a different answer if you look at it now versus 500 years from now. Just like, is owning slaves immoral is a very different question today than it would be 1,000 years ago. And very different, you know? Like, I don't think there's an absolute answer to these morality questions. Mm-hmm. Or I think these morality questions are inherently a function of time and a function of location and a function of something that is amoral in 2019 America might be very moral in 1600 America.
Okay, so you think morality is
a function
that there is no like abstract, independent notion of this is good and this is bad, that it is all determined by cultures and societies based on what point in time they are in.
Yeah. You've heard of Sam Harris's moral landscape?
I haven't.
Where he, in short, very quickly, he imagines all of morality as like a landscape of hills and valleys and stuff like that. And we try to find like a high moral area, low moral area. I think that landscape is constantly changing with time.
Mm.
In one situation, in one case, something that is moral might become immoral.
See, that's one thing where I think I differ significantly with you in that I think there is an absolute morality. I guess even within that that reference to hills and valleys, I think some things are inherently better than other things.
Agreed.
And I believe that this should be where we should start our next episode.
Are we done already? Damn.
All right. I have the meeting at
yeah, that's
2
fine.
o'clock.
It's fine. It's up to you. I can read up on the moral landscape and give you a better idea of what it is.
I thought this went pretty well.
Yeah, I forgot about the recording, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's good that it's still there.
It's still working.
Yeah. Yeah, that was easy, dude. That was chill. There are a bunch of things I want to like bring up. And I want to hear, we should talk about abortion sometime too.
Yeah.
I feel bad that went by so fast. Well, I guess it's a good thing that it went by fast.
Yeah. I mean, I could easily see us doing so many of these, discussing so many different, like we didn't even need to go to the other three topics that we were going to talk about.
Okay, so if we do this more regularly, then we're going to hit the same topics, right? Like, we're not going to do abortion every time. We're not going to talk about abortion every time. We're not going to talk about Constantinople every time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it'll also come together and flow better, too.